So I get a second at bat, and with that, I have the high honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker, who has spent her decades-long career inspiring and shaping public debate on issues of justice, equality, and fair representation. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton is now serving in her 12th term representing the citizens of the District of Columbia. During that time, she has fought to achieve full congressional representation and increased autonomy for the district. She's also earned and worked for better access to higher education for DC students. From her days as a law student, and this is important, and I just want to pause here, so many law students are in this room, draw inspiration from our next speaker, because Eleanor Holmes Norton, as a law student, fought for and led the Mississippi Freedom Summer movement decades ago. And from her roots as a champion of civil rights to her distinguished service in Congress, she has been an active and persistent voice for equality and civil rights. From the days that she began as a law clerk to another civil rights legend, Judge Leon Higginbotham. She served as an attorney for the ACLU, specializing in defending freedom of speech, and as a law professor before becoming the first woman to chair the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. As our mission statement says, our organization strives to shape debate and to build networks so that we can make a difference. Throughout her long and distinguished career, Congresswoman Norton has served as an exemplar of those ideals. We're honored she's here to speak to us today. Please give me a warm welcome for Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much. And thank you, David Frederick, for that very gracious introduction. I tell you, when my good friends of the American Constitution Society first hear my former colleague and good friend, the former governor of Ohio, and then hear Eleanor Holmes Norton, some of you may be saying we just as well as stood home and watched MSNBC. But I hope you agree with me that to hear the insightful comments of a governor, a progressive governor, who continues to shed light in a city that knows very little of it, and particularly comments on the law from someone who's not in our fraternity, that is really refreshing, and I appreciate it. It's an opportunity for me to say a few words to the American Constitution Society. Some of you, of course, are law professors. I have never left academia. Part of the reason is when I was elected, I couldn't help but think, you know, it was harder to get tenure than it was to get elected. So I continue where I was. I go every year to teach one course at Georgetown Law School. I go to retrieve the part of my brain and heart that is still there. I want to discuss some ideas that have been fermenting in my head recently with you today. The two grades animating ideas of my lifetime are equality and democracy. In many ways, they are becoming close to civil faiths in our country. Today, I want to discuss how the intersection between the two produced a period of exceptional progress for our country, and I believe can again. I recognize that to hear a member of Congress today speak of great progress may seem quite quaint. After all, I am a member of the House of Representatives, which is on course to set a record as the least productive in U.S. history. If you will forgive me, I almost need to recall that there was a time in my own lifetime when Americans demanded big changes and Congress responded. Sometimes we called it equality, sometimes democracy, though of course these are different, not interchangeable notions. When, as a student, I joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, working for voting rights in Mississippi, I thought I was working for equality. I was, after all, a Black American girl from segregated Washington, D.C. Yet that same summer, I also went to New York to join the staff of the March on Washington. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Neither equality nor democracy were part of the call of the march in August of 1963. Was talk of equality and democracy interchangeably then, as now, simply a case of loose movement language? I think it is more than that. We wanted change that was so large, it could not be easily encompassed in one word. It is clear that historic change, in fact, occurred. The year after the Great March, Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the first enforceable civil rights legislation since the Civil War. Who knew it was to become my privilege to enforce that act less than 15 years later? In 1965, the very next year, Congress would pass the Voting Rights Act. By 1968, the Congress had passed the Fair Housing Act, the three great human rights laws, in little more than 3 years. Of course, a cacophony of forces and countless numbers of people of every background came together to generate this uncommon change. Human tragedy also played a unique role. As ordinary Americans and giants alike fell, President John F. Kennedy assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X assassinated in 1965. And Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in 1968. Yet remarkably, this was mostly peaceful, if tumultuous change. Was it driven by equal rights, the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments, or by democracy, the yearning to be legitimate actors in the life of our nation? The more amorphous notion, not contained in the Constitution itself. Equality and democracy have confounded the nation from the beginning. The framers could not have created a nation at all had they guaranteed equality to all. Moreover, their tentativeness toward democracy was apparent throughout the Constitutional Convention and is pointedly manifested in Article 1 of the Constitution, requiring senators to be chosen by state legislators unchanged until 1913 with the adoption of the 17th Amendment. In our country, democracy by majority rule came only gradually, whether to men without property, to men of color, or to women. Moreover, democracy as practiced in the West is a creature of the rise of the nation state that assumes that various groups can agree to live together under a regime elected by all the people. Today, as the president responds to Sunni Shiite division that has erupted into war in Iraq, we are contending with nations that did not arise by consent of the governed, but were created from autonomous groups by imperial powers. Conservative Middle East countries adjusted along sectarian lines, valuing autonomous control over democracy within the nation states east of the Suez. Arab nationalism, on the other hand, often has been promoted by minorities in the Mideast, resulting in rule by those minorities, the Sunnis in Iraq, the Alawite in Syria, the Hashemites in Jordan. Just as our framers created their own version of democracy, which did not encompass majority rule, much of the Middle East today is struggling with what democracy means in nations consisting of often competing sectarian groups. We should be very grateful that the founders of our country removed what has been perhaps the greatest impediment to democratic self-government in the Middle East, when in our very first amendment, a state's religion was barred and the free exercise of religion was guaranteed. Nevertheless, the framers left us with dilemmas that we are still acting out. The most serious, of course, has been securing equality as a national value. Witness the Civil War took to establish equality as a tenet of the Constitution. Still, weaving equality into the society began only 50 years ago with the passage of the first of the Civil Rights Act trilogy of the 1960s. These great statutes remain a work in progress. As we prepare to celebrate one of them next year, the 1965 Voting Rights Act has been crippled by the Supreme Court's premature withdrawal of its most potent and effective provision, Section 5 requiring pre-clearance by the Justice Department of changes in voting requirements by southern states where laws have been documented to have restricted voting by minorities. A bipartisan bill to restore and reinvigorate the 65 Act has been introduced, but is languishing. Even as this work must proceed, we have already entered a new era of equality changes. Our country must continue to the work of eliminating political inequality as income inequality takes center stage. The two are most clearly related in people of color, but that does not explain what has happened to the rest of the 99%. Thomas Piketty's new book sensation, Capital in the 21st Century, documents how the rate of return on capital is exceeding the growth rate, so excessively as to produce inequality that undermines democracy itself. Piketty makes the link between equality and democracy that most interests me and has bedeviled the nation from its beginnings. It is the intersection that I spoke of when I began these remarks, and whether we were being facile with language when sometimes we have called the changes we wanted equality and at other times democracy. How much of what we have sought in the name of equality has been simply to be recognized as part of the great democratic polity to say we too are one of you. The decision to eliminate discrimination in finding a job offers a right to equal treatment, but at bottom, all that is guaranteed and all that is desired is the right to be counted among those who cannot be marginalized, but must be considered, not necessarily selected. The protection against discrimination in finding an apartment or a house is at best a right to be included among the applicants rather than shunted, not necessarily to be chosen. Assuring the right to vote is the most perfect intersection between equality and democracy. Voting is an anonymous process. All that is guaranteed is the right to be counted equally among the democratic masses that elect leaders. I am unable to separate democracy and equality as I strive for what the people I represent believe is the country's last great human rights issue: full and equal rights for the American citizens who live in the nation's capital. Their right to a representative in the House of Representatives, like Ted was, one who not only votes in committees, like I do, but on the House floor, on final legislation. Their right to sue two senators, the way Ohio has. Their right to spend their locally raised funds without the indignity of approval from an unaccountable Congress. Who are they with respect to my money? Who had no role, none, in raising those local funds. Their right to spend their local funds as they please. Yes, on abortion services for poor women. And yes, on marijuana decriminalization. Or any other local legal matter without interference from the national legislature. Their right to local legislation that becomes immediately effective without laying over somewhere foreign to that legislation in the Congress, to permit representatives who do not represent them, are totally unaccountable to them, to give them time to decide whether they should seek to overturn the local legislation of somebody else's district, of somebody else's constituents. It cannot be argued that the American citizens I represent are treated equally in their own country when compared with the rights that other Americans take for granted, don't even speak of. The founders of our country who created the nation's capital went to war on the slogan of no taxation without representation. We have shown that they never intended their capital to be a contradiction to the raison d'etre of their revolution. Yet the citizens I represent not only pay taxes without representation. At $12,000 per resident, they pay the highest federal taxes per capita in the nation, and without representation too. It seems clear that the founders of our country were driven by notions of both democracy and equality. They were not represented in the body that levied those taxes, and they were treated unequally from other British citizens. DC residents are in the same predicament today, more than 2 centuries after their Great Revolution, and have been so since the nation was created, befuddled by a capital that they believed should not be part of an existing state. The framers created an anomaly in the Constitution, leaving ultimate jurisdiction to the Congress. And just as they believed that Congress would somehow deal with the question of slavery, they thought Congress would somehow deal with this anomaly. The Home Rule Act of 1973 gave the city a local government, and Congress gave the city what is called a delegate, that's me, a member of the House of Representatives without a vote, who has all the rights of other members, except that right that defines representation, the right to vote on final legislation. The failure to correct what in the 18th century could be seen as an anomaly today leaves the United States as the only nation that disempowers the people of its capital, a rank injustice on which our nation has been called out as a violation of international law. Both democracy and equality will be unrealized until the nation extinguishes this stain. If one considers the American experience, speaking of democracy and equality interchangeably makes some sense. It was an imperfection in both American democracy and equality when men without property and women had no say in choosing their leaders. Ever since the founders fought a revolution because they were treated unequally as British citizens and founded a democratic republic, the two notions, democracy and equality, have been of a piece. Today, 650,000 citizens who live in the nation's capital are where the founders of our nation were in 1776, treated unequally in the right to unfettered local self-government, yet charged taxes and compelled to observe laws they cannot vote for or against. All will be corrected when the District of Columbia becomes the 51st state of the United States of America. As an American, I had the luck to be born in time to be part of great changes as the nation took on unequal and undemocratic treatment, when remedies, I assure you, were at least as unlikely as they may seem for equal rights and full democracy for the citizens of the nation's capital today. I choose to live neither with doubt nor in hope. Like those before me who helped create change, I embrace the notion, born with the nation, that in America, imperfection in governance has been with us from the beginning, only to succumb to actors willing to take on the struggle. Thank you very much.